part of Kahlile Bliss Mehr, and in other countries he's called Bliss. He refers, is that right, Sister Meredith? He refers to himself as Bliss. This is his wife, beautiful wife, wearing Ukrainian dress, and his mother, sweet thing. Okay, well I can sure hear you, thank you. Well, anyway, I first heard of him through Nancy Hilton when she arranged a researcher for my father's line of descendancy in Berdichev, Ukraine, which is about 100 some miles from Kiev. I just don't know what I'm doing. Okay, thank you. All right, so like this. Right? I'm just used to shouting at my husband without any mic, and so I put a mic in my hands, I continue to shout. Kahlile was on a mission for the church in Ukraine, and he kindly transmitted and translated some messages in a couple of my books to the woman who was doing the research. And sometime after his return he was doing a church mission in Russia and in Germany. Is that right? That was in Germany. In the area. Mostly Kiev, or Kiev as they say, Ukraine. Here he comes. And sometime after his return from that, I contacted him. He's always had a connection with those of Jewish heritage, has served on the board of the International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies. He has worked extensively with archivists in Eastern Europe to identify genealogical sources, including Jewish records. He is the author of 2 books, yes? And the one that I have, which is fascinating, can't stop reading it, it's called Mormon Missionaries Enter Eastern Europe. And it took 100 years for the Mormon missionaries to get into Europe. The Baptists were welcomed in some places, the Lutherans were, because they preached to a whole assemblage. But the Mormons, they believed that each soul needed to be converted. And these Eastern Europeans hadn't heard of that. Is that right? And so they were very unsure that they wanted us to hear, that they wanted their people to hear our message. He has done genealogical research in Russia, and he worked in the Family History Library. He taught for the BYU Independent Studies program. I am very pleased to present with great honor Kahlile Bliss Mehr.
Marlena is the one that asked me to address certain topics, some of which she's already mentioned briefly. And the first one I'd like to deal with tonight is my work with the Orson Hyde Club at Brigham Young University. In January 1964, the Yovel dancers, an indirect result of the Jewish proselytizing program in Southern California, announced in the church news their pending performance trip to Israel in the coming summer. Directed by Mildred Handy, the troupe of 50 youth dancers from the Pasadena Stake had performed throughout the fall and winter and had received a standing ovation from 6,500 people at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. The group contacted BYU to set up the tour. Performing during July 1964, the troupe swept the country with singing and dancing routines. Abba Eban, famed Israeli statesman and deputy to the prime minister at that date, awarded the dancers the Israeli Peace Medal, only the second one given to that date, Pope John the 23rd having received the first. Guri Kadman, the mother of Israeli folk dancing, was visibly touched and wept at a performance. The Yeovil dancers were the predecessors to the Orson Hyde Club. Mildred Handy and her family moved to Provo and established the Orson Hyde Building Bridges of Understanding to Israel Society, Club for short, in late 1967. They passed on the responsibility to others in 1970. I had a leadership position from 1971 to 1972. The club then faded and ended in 1974. The faculty advisor was Cleon Skousen. I will share some experiences from my journal concerning the Orson Hyde Club. I became aware of the club in early 1970 during my first year at Brigham Young University, attending a performance in Logan on March 28. Soon thereafter, I engaged in learning about Jews. On April 9, 1970, I wrote, I read a whole book on the Jews in Russia in 2 sittings today. The club had a weekly dance practice, occasional lessons and performances. I wrote on May 19, 1971, Friday last, the Orson Hyde Club danced for an audience of 300 high priests and their wives. It was our last show. Us boys got to pound through Joshua while Janet, my dance partner, and I shuffled lightly through Kittinam. I'm ever so glad to be part of the club. It has encouraged me to study about Israel and has inspired me to further broaden my vision of life. One of my greatest experiences as a club member was to perform folk dances alone in a talent show at Fort Knox, Kentucky, at the end of my ROTC basic summer camp on August 4th, 1971. Quoting from my journal, the cadets were all waiting as we filed in from a side door and went backstage. I was third on the show and I had to get into my costume fast. White pants, shirt, blue vest, and sash. Then I was on stage. Run, run, spin, stamp, forward, reverse. Suddenly, I was going in the wrong direction. I thought, will the dance still work out? It did, and my error wasn't noticed. The music ended, and I stamped to a stop. The applause swelled, and I swelled too. I stepped forward to introduce the next dance, and they kept on applauding. So I waited, appreciating the applause. Then I talked about folk dancing and introduced my next dance, Hora Haktana, Happy Shepherdess, but I left out the translation. One of the club members organized a group of Israeli dancers in the same mold as Orson Hyde in Southern California during the summer break. I show this slide as an example of what the Orson Hyde Club troupe looked like, as I have no picture of the troupe, even though I made efforts to acquire one prior to this presentation. The club filled a social need for me, as I noted on September 17, 1971. The Orson Hyde Club ceases not to impress me for the abundance of friendship and spirit I feel exuding from all of its members. At the beginning of the fall semester of 1971, we staged a publicity drive that garnered much attention. On September 19, 1971, I recorded. Near 150 people attended the opening dance. We pulled through 6 dances, 2 songs, and a bit of a lesson and 2 hours of free dance. I was completely exhausted by it all. We hit a snag at first. The building's security officer demanded that we dance with shoes. That was rough on the slick floor, but we had to comply. It depressed us all. I began teaching, and the place filled and filled. We sat down and sang. Everyone sang, even the boys. Some beginners stuck out the whole thing, and we were even trying out the hard dances. I noticed one girl and pulled her into the dance. The next morning, I went to the president's, Dallin Oaks, reception. He came out with his 2 daughters, and I was quite shocked to see that one of them, Jenny Oaks, was the same girl I had pulled into the dance the evening before. A memorable club meeting on October 12, 1971, featured a Mormon who sought to fly in the Israeli Air Force. They asked if he was Jewish. He said he was from the tribe of Joseph. They said, "That's Jewish." He spoke of the 6-Day War and related a story I have not tried to verify of how 3 men in white demanded the surrender of the Egyptians at Gaza and impressed them so that they did it. Bernie Rose spoke as recorded on February 14, 1972. He related the story of a newspaper man who questioned some Mormon Jews and asked if they worried about the fact that they were a minority, and whether they bewailed the fact that no Mormon Jew was a general authority. The president replied, "No, we don't worry too much about it. You see, one of our relatives is in charge of the whole affair." As I mentioned, the club sponsor was Cleon Skousen, a well-known religion professor at BYU. The most prominent recollection I have is when we performed twice on April 19th, 1972. At 9:15, we were off to Salt Lake. We arrived at KSL and found the show was to be a half hour earlier than expected. We jumped into our costumes. The group was in peak spirit and danced tremendously. The rabbi told us we were the best, and everyone thanked us. The evening rolled around, and we met at the Union Building at the University of Utah. A later group came up from Provo, and Orson Hyde was complete. We were all nervous and scared. The show started weakly as we bummed the first song, but the rest was a crescendo. The most pleasing moment to me was when they all arose as we sang the national anthem of Israel. Brother Skousen sure was happy and was bumping around with congratulations for everyone. At the beginning of the 1972 fall semester, Daniel Ludlow addressed the group. I recorded on the 26th of October. Daniel Ludlow talked of Israel's history and the true meaning of the words Hebrew, Israelite, and Jew. When he went to Israel in 1969 with Brother LeGrand Richards, the apostle was constantly greeting the Jews as cousins. And that would lead to a patient explanation by Brother Richards for the next 45 minutes of what it meant to be cousins. Brother Ludlow had many personal incidents to relate, such as a visit with Ben Gurion to study Scripture. Those are my recollections of the Orson Hyde Club. Now I'd like to transition to another topic. I had some contact with B'nai Shalom. I noticed our president would say B'nai. I'm not sure of the exact pronunciation. Over the years, I became aware of and did some research at the beginning of this century on a Jewish proselytizing program that existed from 1975 to 1984, and interviewed Harry Glick 3 times on the topic from 2000 to 2002. I will summarize the history of that effort. Newly installed church president Spencer W. Kimball addressed the concern for Jews to church leaders in April 1975. He said, quote, "I am told that there are in 5 or 6 cities in the United States, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, more Jews than in all the rest of the world. And many of them are noble souls. They must hear the gospel. They must accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Master. And that day, I think, cannot come until we, the witnesses of Jesus Christ, get busy and present the message to them. This initiated a 9-year effort to specifically address Jews with the church message of the restored gospel. The First Council of 70, traditionally responsible for missionary work, took the lead in organizing the new program. In a May letter to President Hugh Pinnock of the Pennsylvania Harrisburg Mission, President S. Dilworth Young, senior member of the First Council of 70, wrote, quote, "We are anxious to do all we can to commence proselyting work among the Jewish people as counseled by President Kimball, and want to begin more conscientiously in metropolitan areas." And that have a high concentration of Jewish people. On June 20th, 1975, President Pinnock created a Jewish zone of 10 missionaries. It was the first of Jewish zones created in several missions along the eastern seaboard. Concurrently, headquarters initiated the authoring of lesson plans and approaches designed to reach a Jewish audience. An unsuspecting trio of church members with Jewish heritage received letters to serve as its members. Philip Rennert, a stockbroker from Nevada, Ron Zeidner, a seminary teacher from Northern California, and Harry Glick, a Salt Lake area architect. Elliot Landau, a professor from the University of Utah, was on the committee but did not attend meetings. The biweekly meetings. He was a liaison with President Kimball and kept him updated frequently on the progress of the committee. As of November 1975, the committee met biweekly at church headquarters. They authored and distributed officially 3 lessons to give a Jew a foundation from which to receive the regular discussions, and several pamphlets and manuals. The program lost steam in the early 1980s and was officially ended in 1984. It never extended beyond the borders of the United States. It had nothing to do with the effort to establish a church presence in Israel, but was canceled when the building of the Jerusalem Center began to face heavy opposition. Knowing this history was valuable to me later on. I became acquainted with a prominent Jewish genealogist, Sally Ann Sack, one of the editors of Avotenu. And she wrote briefly in a editorial column in Avotenu that she had seen lessons by which the Mormons would proselytize Jews, and was wondering if that program was still in effect. And so I was able to contact her and update her on the situation and tell her the history of the program and say, no, it is not in effect. And then there was no further problem on that issue. I will now transition to my work in Eastern Europe, another topic Marlene asked me to talk about. We each have an individual mission in life. In summary, my life outside of my family has revolved around Russian, genealogy, history, and Jews. Looking back later in life, I see the seeds of my mission planted early on. I served a mission in Brazil from 1967 to 1969. I wrote on my journal on June 29, 1969, just before sacrament, I conversed with the son of the branch president. I told him I was desirous to learn Russian. His father is a Russian, born in Siberia, captive of the German army in Lithuania, immigrant to Brazil after the war. After returning from my mission, I wrote in March 29, 1970, if I learn Russian, that would prepare me for a particular calling, a mission to Russia. The idea has occurred to me for about the last 2 years. Regarding genealogy in the Jews, I wrote on January 27, 1972, genealogy, the study of the Jews, Bible reading, and Russian have filled the last few days with a sense that I am accomplishing my life's purpose. I graduated in April 1973 with a degree in Russian. Concurrently, I pursued my interest in genealogy. On November 11, 1976, I wrote, "This morning in the temple I contemplated the future and felt strongly that I should prepare myself to be an expert of Russian bibliography and records." I wrote a paper on the genealogical sources in Russian archives when little was known about the subject. Then on March 10, 1977, I wrote, "Today was very significant. One of my dreams materialized. This afternoon I talked with Dennis Neuenschwander of the Genealogical Society of Utah, and we discussed my involvement in a research project to determine the genealogical value of materials in Russian archives. The pattern of my life's work now begins to focus. I have often pondered why I took Russian. Perhaps this is why." Then on January 24, 1979, my journal records an impression. Quote, "I will be called to forward the collection of genealogical records in the Soviet Union. A great portion of Russia is of the house of Israel." This did not happen in 12 years later, when my vision was fulfilled. In 1992, I was sent to Russia to pursue record acquisitions for family history. I arrived in Moscow and was greeted by two genealogists, a driver, and an interpreter. One of the genealogists is Jewish, Dmitry Panov, second from the left. They soon discovered that I knew more Russian than the interpreter knew English. So it was down to the driver and the two genealogists. They took me to a building where their office was located. It was also an archive. I did not know what archive it was. They took me into the stacks, and they opened one of the containers and pulled out some papers and said, "These are the papers of Vladimir Lenin." I then realized I was in the Communist Party archive. And my host said, "You're the first American who's ever been let into this area." A real change in the circumstances as the archives of Eastern Europe began to open up to genealogists, a resource that had been shut off for 70 years prior to that date. I didn't have the heart to tell them that I didn't care about the papers of Vladimir Lenin. Now I'm going to summarize a little bit about our acquisitions efforts there. You will notice that we began to acquiring records in Eastern Europe before the 1990s. Those were exceptions to the rule. And in the early 90s, quick succession, country after country, opened their doors to our acquisitions program. Most recently, the Czech Republic. In 2016, acquisitions has ended in a few countries. Acquisitions is ongoing in several countries. Filming has ended in 4 countries when the collection was not yet complete. For various reasons, some of it governmental, some of it financial. But when your government administration keeps changing all the time, you have to prove yourself again to the leaders, and so this has happened on occasion. There have been little or no acquisitions in several countries. But in some cases, as for instance Latvia, where, by the way, we have recently started acquiring records, about 5 years ago published all of their genealogical records for free on the internet. For 20 years we tried to get in there, and they always asked for too much money. Then they turned around and did it and made it available for free. So I haven't quite figured that one out. Some very positive developments is that several of these countries have begun posting the images on the internet for free. And the Family History Library is digitizing its film collection and is providing online access to some records in the home. And Family Search Indexing has begun to provide name access to some records. So here I am standing in front of the newly built Russian Historical Archive in St. Petersburg. An absolutely wonderful facility, top of the line, something that wouldn't have been imaginable in the Soviet period, when genealogy was a non-issue and historical records were preserved only for academics and government officials. But this archive is available to anyone. I'd like to transition now to my experience with church history in Eastern Europe. I've been dealing with family history and now church history. History is one of my passions I mentioned earlier. I worked for 3 years in the historical department from 1977 until 1980 before transferring to family history. Later, during my genealogical work, I met early members and missionaries and eventually wrote The History of the Church in Eastern Europe, which was published in 2002. It was written over a 15-year period and took 5 years to get published. It was the first publication of a joint agreement between Deseret Book and BYU Press. It was a limited run and was released with little publicity, so it is not well known. The first convert baptism occurred in 1895 in St. Petersburg, Johann Lindelof. This became important in the late 1990s when the church had to prove, in order to continue to be recognized in the country, that it had been there for more than 100 years. But for most of that 100 years, communism thwarted missionary efforts until 1990, when missionaries could begin to serve there. 19 new missions were established in Eastern Europe from 1990 to 2002. This photo is of one of my former Russian professors, Don Jarvis, and missionaries, and is taken in front of St. Basil's Cathedral on Red Square. President Kimball was the first church president to visit Eastern Europe, but only Poland, which he dedicated for missionary work in 1977. Gordon B. Hinckley visited Ukraine and Russia, the heart of the former Soviet Union, in 2002. It was an epic event for the members. Russia banned missionary work earlier this year. I would like to read about the impact as described in a letter I received on Monday from a nephew who is serving as a volunteer in St. Petersburg. This last week, actually just on Saturday, our mission had a baptism in my old ward and center. The work is just moving forward at an ever-increasing speed. This law is all part of the Lord's plan here in Russia, and it is evident that the miracles that are continuing to happen in this mission. There have been many volunteers in the mission, especially recently, who have had people just show up at ward meetings and become investigators, who are super prepared to hear the gospel. And that is without preaching to anyone on the streets. It just comes as a testament and reminder to me that the Lord will bless us if we put trust in Him. Our investigator, Sasha, has been starting to read the Book of Mormon, and he's a Jew. He still has a strong desire to learn about the gospel, and that is just another huge blessing. While my first mission to Russia, my family history work, was in family history, my second mission was in church history from 2014 to 2015. In this slide, we are standing in front of the statue commemorating the introduction of Christianity into the Slavic world, which occurred in 988. My wife and I spent 18 months focused on establishing church history as an important part of Jewish culture, as an important part of church culture in the southern half of the East Europe area, Ukraine, Bulgaria, and Armenia. I might mention one more detail about this picture. The second person from the left is Zoya Gulko, who translated the Book of Mormon from English into Ukrainian, and she is Jewish. We established a fully functioning church history preservation center in Kiev, accessioned 72 collections, and trained Nadia Stasiuk, a Ukrainian, for 6 months to prepare her to be the center director after our departure. The outside of the building, the archive is in one room in this building. The archive seen from the inside, and Nadia, the director. We taught her the principles and procedures of records preservation, scanning and stitching images, cataloging, housing and inventory control of archival materials, creating print copies of selected collections, operating a video camera, and editing videos. We trained church history advisors to supervise the submission of annual histories and to conduct oral histories. We recorded and processed 29 oral interviews and received 21 interviews from church history advisors. We scanned thousands of manuscript pages of records from various places in Ukraine. We visited historic sites in Kiev, Lviv, Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkiv, all in Ukraine, and also Sofia, Bulgaria, Yerevan, Armenia, Yekaterinburg, and Kaliningrad, Russia. We are standing in front of the statue to the legendary founders of Kiev on Maidan, which is where the demonstrations occurred between October 2013 and the killings, or the shootings, by snipers in February of 2014, just prior to the departure of the president, Yanukovych. And Ukraine was free from his influence after that. We were there and going to take pictures of each other in front of this statue when someone came out of the crowd and motioned at the camera and motioned at us, indicating that she would take a picture of us in front of the statue. So we did, and she turned to walk away when I started speaking to her in Russian, and we learned that she was the church historian for her branch in Mariupol, Ukraine. And she told us that she didn't know what she was doing in downtown Kiev because she had a lot of things to take care of before she returned to Mariupol on the next day. But now she knew why she was there. Anna Bigun is the person on the left. This is at the train station when she returned from Mariupol and gave us some of her records. You'll also notice, if you can remember the other slide, in this row of people is Nadia Stasiuk, second from the right. We knew nothing about her at this point, but I'll explain how we learned about her. We received information from Nancy Hilton here in the United States. Somebody wanted to do some genealogical research in Ukraine. Her name is Marlena Baker. Did I get that right? Okay, Muchnik Baker. Anyway, the ancestry went back to Zhytomyr, and this Sister Clark, had served in Zhytomyr, and she told us that there was a sister named Nadia who could do the research. And when we contacted Nadia, we realized it was this person we had already met in the train station. So over a period of several months, Nadia found several hundred names for Marlena. And through this experience, we knew that Nadia was acquainted with archives and that she had a passion for history. And this led eventually for her being called as the director of the Records Preservation Center. So can you see the pattern? This unexpected meeting in downtown Kiev, the friend of the person who was the historian in Mariupol, and then this sister missionary telling us about Nadia, who, by the way, at that time lived in Kiev. And the last thing that I would like to point out is that she lived a 10-minute walk from where we established the RPC. So I knew that the hand of the Lord was directing our efforts in this matter. Now I'd like to transition to my concluding thoughts concerning the relationship between Mormons and Jews and Eastern Europe. Hopefully you can read this slide. In 1843, the prophet Joseph Smith said with regard to a mission he anticipated establishing in Russia with Orson Hyde and George J. Adams, in which he wrote, they were to introduce the fullness of the gospel to the people of that vast empire, and also to which is attached some of the most important things concerning the advancement of the kingdom of God in the last days, which cannot be explained at this time. One of the important things to occur in Eastern Europe is the reconstitution of the house of Israel. Where did the tribes disappear to after the Assyrian conquest? The Bible says to the lands of the north. What lands are north of Israel? Ukraine, Russia. If you go slightly northwest, the Baltic states, Scandinavia, and a little bit further west, the British Isles, Germany, and France. That is where the lost tribes of Israel are. Until the end of the 20th century, over 95% of the members of the church were declared to be from Ephraim or Manasseh. What about the other lost tribes, Reuben, Asher, Gad, Simeon, etc.? When will they be gathered? The answer is now, in Eastern Europe. Ephraim and Manasseh are in the minority with regard to patriarchal blessings, and all other tribes are represented. I did a survey of some of our acquaintances in Ukraine, and the responses were from our friends that they were from the tribes of Reuben, Simeon, Benjamin, and Manasseh. So Manasseh is also there, as well as Ephraim, but they are in the minority. The point is, the house of Israel is not gathered without the gospel being spread throughout the former communist world. And I might add that the communist regime was the adversary's effort to stop the entrance of the gospel into that part of the world. And while the work there is still slow and difficult, I foresee the day when many thousands will join the church in that part of the world. Just a matter of being patient, taking it a step at a time, and trusting in the Lord. The Jews also have a significant heritage in Eastern Europe. 80% of Jewish ancestry traces back to Eastern Europe. 18 of the 25 regional special interest groups in Jewish Gen focus on Eastern Europe. And the first to the sixth aliyahs to Israel were primarily from Russia and Eastern Europe. Because of this heritage and my knowledge of the topic of genealogical records in Eastern Europe, I served on the IAJGS board, International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies, for 6 years. I had an experience in Paris when we held a conference there that I would like to relate. July 17th, 2012. There was an empty seat next to me at the gala banquet until just before it began that was occupied by Racheli Kreisberg-Greenblatt. She inquired about baptism for the dead. I explained that the real purpose is to unite families for eternity. At one point, she said she was the granddaughter of Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter. Of all people she could have sat by, it was by the only Mormon in the crowd. Simon was the subject of the most recent Holocaust controversy at that time. I told her that her grandmother's name was removed from the database and that it was an unauthorized submission. However, I also mentioned that those in the next life have the option to accept or reject the ordinance. She left, and I thought she was gone for the evening, even though the meal was not finished. After a while, Michael Goldstein, who is second from the right, sitting down in this image, came over and asked what I had told Racheli because she understood that her grandmother was still baptized. I repeated that I had said just the opposite. I noticed that she was watching from Michael's seat. Michael went back, talked to her, and she came back with a big smile. The misunderstanding had been cleared up. We had a good conversation where she told me that she was the only granddaughter of Simon, her mother being the only child. I offer this story as symbolic of the fact that Jews and Mormons can be friends when they understand each other. Isaiah chapter 11 talks about the time when Ephraim and Judah will be united. Ephraim will not envy Judah, and Judah will not vex Ephraim. Regarding the last days, when this union will occur, Christ emphasized these topics, the gathering and the return of Elijah, in 6 chapters in 3rd Nephi, roughly a third of the pages that recount his advent in America. Why did he consider that so important to teach at that time to those who lived in America? It's because it was so significant in the history of the world. And they will be gathered together, the Jews and the Mormons will be reunited for 2 major purposes. The one is to obtain all the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the other is to establish the capitals of the millennial world. Ephraim, the New Jerusalem, and Judah, the Old Jerusalem. The prophet Joseph said, "What was the object of gathering the people of God in any age of the world? The main object was to build up the house unto the Lord, a house whereby he could reveal unto his people the ordinances of his house and the glories of his kingdom, and teach the people the ways of salvation. For there are certain ordinances and principles that when they are taught and practiced must be done in a place or house built for that purpose. The house of Israel was symbolized in temples anciently, a brass sea set on 12 oxen in the temple compound. The 12 oxen represented the 12 tribes of Israel. The priests cleansed themselves ritually in the bath, a precursor to baptism, established by Christ later on as the first step to salvation. The house of Israel continues to be symbolized in temples today. For more than 160 years, proxy baptisms have been performed on the backs of the oxen, representing the house of Israel. The blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are offered in the temple in other ordinances, fulfilling the covenant offered to the house of Israel anciently. The purpose is to establish eternal families, eternal family units, as part of God's eternal family. And the second purpose, as I mentioned, is to establish millennial capitals. As Isaiah said, "Let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob." And then later on, "For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." As restated by Daniel Ludlow in 1972 to the Orson Hyde Club, the law will go forth from Zion, or Christ will rule as King of Kings from Missouri, and as Lord of Lords from Jerusalem, from where will go forth his word. Jews and Mormons share the same heritage and destiny. Do we all realize that the golden plates were given to Joseph on Rosh Hashanah, September 22nd, 1827? And Rosh Hashanah, also known as the Feast of Trumpets, signifies the time of Israel's first harvest, the day of remembrance of God's covenants with Israel, the announcement of revelation or truth and preparation for God's holiest times, including the Messianic age. And this will be accomplished when Joseph and Ephraim are united, when they see eye to eye without envy or vexation. And God said in the Old Testament, "I will be their God, and they will be my people." Thank you.